In this video, we'll be discussing coding in SPSS. Recall that coding is simply a way of rephrasing our variables from one format to another, and there's a variety of different types of coding that we can do. We'll talk about several in this class, and we'll talk about several methods by which we can accomplish these codings, but it's important to acknowledge that there's many different ways that we can implement coding in SPSS, so please don't feel that because we're discussing one particular method in class, that's the only way, or frankly, that that's even the most efficient way. My goal is to introduce a way in which you can accomplish this if you ever want to when you're attempting to replicate someone's research or implementing these methods within your own. Where we'll start today is by discussing dummy coding. And recall that dummy coding is simply a way of breaking out a categorical variable with multiple options into individual variables that refer to only one of those options each. So for instance, we'll be working with source, which is the source of the data for this particular data set. And we have three options. I can investigate them in variable view to see that option 1 represents the front page, option 2 represents a Google search, and option 3 represents other. So here I'll be investigating and creating variables for front page, that is the number 1, other, that is the number 3, and Google search, that is the number 2, which isn't displayed in my first 37 observations. How I can implement dummy coding in SPSS very quickly is by going to the Transform menu and then scrolling down to Create Dummy Variables. I click on this and then I'll right-click Variables to display variable names. Scrolling down, I move over the variable that I want to create dummy variables for into the Create Dummy Variables For box. Below, I have to enter the root name for my new variables, and again, because we have three options within source, we're going to be creating three dummy variables, one for each of the source options. I'll just use source as my root name, and SPSS is going to add information onto there depending on what my options are, and then select OK to run this data method. After this is run, I get some output based on the inputs that I made. I'll X out of this because it's not of particular interest to me, and then look at my new variables that have been created. Here I can see that source 1 has a 1 whenever the original source had a 1, and a 0 at any other time. I can see that source 2 has a 1 whenever the original source has a 2 and a 0 at any other time. And it's all zeros right now because the original source doesn't have any 2's on my screen right now. Lastly, source 3 has a 1 whenever the original source has a 3 and a 0 at any other time. And these are my dummy coded variables created in SPSS. Well, along with dummy coding, another common option is to use effects coding, which isolates some of our variable effects in a different way. To implement effects coding for, say, inclusion in a regression analysis, we don't include all of our variables. We select two and have a third reference category. In this particular case, I'll select the website and Google, and my third reference category will be other. In order to create my effects variables, I go to Transform and Compute Variable. I'm going to type in the variable name, which will be source EFF1 to represent the first variable, that was the website. And then instead of typing in a numeric expression as we've done before, I'm going to go to the if box. Within this box, I'm going to perform this particular coding, but only if a certain criteria has been met. In this particular case, I'm going to pull in the source, and I only want it to do the particular coding if the source is equal to 1. Now, if the source is equal to 1, the coding that I want it to implement is I want it to implement the coding 1. And what you'll see is this will create a variable where I have 1s wherever the original source was 1 and a missing value everywhere else. This looks partially finished, and that's because this is partially finished. I need to go in and indicate what coding values I want for the other values of source. So I'm going to do the same thing, go to compute variable, but this time, instead of changing my variable, I'm going to leave the target variable the exact same because I'm going to go to if and start to fill in these blanks. So if the original source variable was 2 and my effects coded 1, then a 2 is going to receive the value of 0, exactly the same as it did in dummy coding. I'm going to be asked if I want to change the existing variable, and because I'm using this if menu, I'm going to click OK, because it's only going to overwrite the particular cases where source equals 2, which is not data I've already entered. You'll actually notice no change on my screen here, and that's not because there weren't any changes in the variable, that's because on my screen no source equals to 2 is displaying. Last but not least, for my referenced effects code third option, because it's the third category, source equal to 3, in effects coding, my reference category is coded as a -1. So I'll code it as -1 and hit OK. Wherever source equals to 3, now I expect that to be filled in with a -1. To complete my effects coding, I need to create an effects variable for my second variable. That was source equal to 2. So I'll go on and do that now. You're welcome to pause the screen if you prefer, and that way you can follow along, try it yourself if you would like. Fantastic. At this point, I have my second effects coded variable with zeros wherever there was an original 1, a 1 wherever there was an original 2, and a -1 wherever there was an original 3. And I have two effects coded variables in SPSS. While you may or may not use effects coding, learning how to create conditional coding, that is, using that if menu to do multiple different codes within a single variable, is really handy and really important. In fact, for some types of coding, it's the only way that you can code those variables. All right, well, let's talk about how we can collapse continuous data down into categories. When does this happen? Well, sometimes you'll see variables like age, but within an analysis or within a particular documentation or data set, age is not available as a continuous variable. Now, in your data set, you might have collected age as a continuous variable, but to compare your results to others, you may need to collapse age into the categories used in other research. The way in which we can do this is to go to Transform and then Recode. Now there are two options: recode into the same variable, which will overwrite the current existing data, and recode into different variables, which will create a new variable that doesn't overwrite the original data. I can think of very few reasons where you would recode into the same variable, so I always recommend recoding into a different variable. I'm going to right-click, select Display Variable Names, and then scroll down and indicate that age is the variable that I'd like to recode. The new variable that I'll call this is cat age, indicating that I'm going to create categories for age. And in my label, the label for the new variable, I'll indicate this is a categorized age. I'll write a note for myself for comparison with pre-published data. I'll hit change to let SPSS know this is what I'd like the output variable to be named. Now it's time to actually go in and categorize the data appropriately. To do this, I'll click Old and New Values, and there's a variety of different options that I can select here, some of which we'll play with through the rest of this video. For me, what I'm going to do is categorize ages 0 through 20, 21 through 40, 41 through 60, and 61 through the oldest age in the data set as my different categories. To start, I'm going to do the lowest value through a value. So in this case, I want the lowest age through the value of 20, and that's going to be my first category with a value of 1. After entering this, I hit the Add button to add the lowest age through 20 will now be recoded into a variable with a category of 1 for those values. Next, I want to do the age of 21 through 40, and so I'm going to type in 21 for the pre and 40 as my total range. Here, the value I'll select to be 2, and then I'll click Add, and we can see that SPSS will take all the ages with a value of 21 through 40 and code them in their new variable to be 2. The third category is going to be 41 to 60, so now I'm going to do any values in the range of 41 to 60 will be recoded into a new value of 3. And finally, I'll start at the age of 61 and go through the highest age in my data set, and that will be coded as a value of 4. Notice again that what this is going to do is take my continuous variable age and split it into 4 categories that I've selected. In this case, I've selected them to be comparable to a hypothetical other study that has grouped age in this way so that I can compare my results. After I'm comfortable with the age coding, I'm going to click Continue and then click OK to run the analysis. If I scroll over slightly, you'll see the new variable, categorical age, and if I compare it to original age, I can see that when the age is between 21 and 40, it was coded as a 2. When the age is between 41 and 60, it was coded as a 3. And when the age is less than 20, it was coded as a 1. So things seem to have been coded appropriately. Now sometimes what can happen is I want to take some of these categories and collapse them down to be listed as fewer categories. Say I've created my categorical age groups, but because the age groups or the number of individuals in the 61 plus are so high, what I'd like to do is recategorize this information to be something different. In fact, what I can do in this particular case is I'd like to keep categories 1, 2, and 3, but I'd like to collapse categories 4 and 3 down to be a single category 3, which in my example would represent the ages of 41 plus. How I can do this is, again, go to Transform and recode into different variables. And this time, instead of recoding my original age, I'll play around with recoding my categorical age, and I'll just write this as new cat age. And I'll label this as categorical age with the third and fourth groups listed together. And select Change to update my output variable in SPSS. I'll click on Old and New Values and remove all of the information that I currently have because this isn't going to apply. And for the old value of 1, that is the participants who are under 20, the new value that I want to be is 1. That is, I want to copy the old value. For the old value of 2, again, I want to copy the old value, and I can simply select Copy the Old Value to do exactly that. For the old value of 3, I again want to copy the old value, but for the old value of 4, I want this value to be changed. That is, I wanted to collapse group 3 and 4, so instead of listing 4 as its own group, every person with the number 4 I now want to list as 3. That is, every person who was previously identified as 61 plus, I now want to be identified within my third age group, which will now represent 41 plus. After I'm comfortable with my new coding, I'll click Continue and then OK to create a new categorical age, which whenever an individual, again, would be identified with a 4, now they're simply identified with a 3. I could go into my variable view now and recode with the values. My original categorical age, the value of 1 was less than 20, or 20 or less. The value of 2 stood for 21 to 40. The value of 3 stood for 41 to 60. The value of 4 stood for 61 plus. In my new categorical variable, now I have 1 representing 20 or less, 2 representing 21 to 40, just like before. But now the category of 3 represents 41 plus because I've combined my category of 41 to 60 and 61 plus. So this is a generic category that handles all of the ages 41 and over. Times you might do this in an applied research setting are if you have multiple categories for, say, a race or a ethnicity and need to collapse them down because there's few observations within that group and you don't have enough observations to perform statistical analyses on them. Instead of throwing away the data, what you might choose to do instead is to include that data simply by collapsing the categories together so that all of the data is available, but in a newly defined group. And again, the interpretation of group 3 has now slightly changed. It no longer represents 41 to 60, it represents 41 and over. So there's an interpretational change that happens here, but sometimes that interpretational change can be worth keeping the data instead of getting rid of it when the sample size within one of the groups is too small to be usable. All right, well, for the final thing that we'll discuss in this video, we'll discuss recoding particular items. Now, in some of my variables, you'll see that the variable in the questions has a star in front of it. I've added these for my own benefit so that I can see when variable phrasings seem to indicate the opposite direction. So for instance, question number 2 says, I feel that I have a number of good qualities, while question number 3 says, all in all, I'm inclined to feel that I'm a failure. Question number 2 thus is phrased positively, and question number 3 is phrased negatively. So if a person strongly agrees with question number 2, I would tend to expect them to disagree with question number 3. Now, as all of these have been rated currently strongly disagree to strongly agree, when I create a sum or a mean score, it would make sense if instead of taking the sum or the mean of a 4 with a 4, I would actually reverse one of these. So that is, if you score a 4 on question 3, when I'm doing my sum score, I would reverse that 4 and count it as a 1. So if you strongly believe that you're a failure, that's the opposite or akin to a 1 on believing you have a number of good qualities. In terms of reverse coding, there's a lot of details to discuss as to when and how it's appropriate. In this video, we'll stick to how we can perform this in SPSS. To reverse code an item, simply go to Transform, and then we can go to Recode into different variables. I'll start with question 3 because this seemed like a good one. And actually, before I start, I'll go on and hit the Reset button so that I don't have to manually update all of my analyses and delete everything. So I'll pull in question 3, and the output name for my output variable I'll call RQ3, which for me stands for Recoded question number 3. For the label, I'll write Recoded question 3 and plan to update it with the full question text later. I'll click Change to update this label in SPSS, and then go to Old and New Values. Now for my old value, whenever the old value was a 1, now I want my new value to be reverse coded. That is, if you strongly disagreed that you're a failure, I want that to be coded as the strongest positive, which in our scale is a 4. Whenever you mildly disagreed, then I want it to be coded as a mild agree. And whenever you agree, I want it to be coded as a disagree. And whenever you strongly agree, I want it to be coded as a strongly disagree. So you're seeing that I'm going through all of my different response options and coding the opposite, which is, of course, where the name reverse coding comes from. After completing this, I'll select Continue and then select OK to create my new variable. If I compare RQ3, and I can move this quickly so that RQ3 is next to Q3 in my data set by selecting the row, clicking and dragging up to where I want it to be. Comparing RQ3 to Q3, I can see wherever Q3 was a 1, RQ3 is now a 4. Wherever Q3 was a 2, RQ3 is now a 3. Wherever Q3 was a 4, RQ3 is now a 1. And wherever Q3 was a 3, RQ3 is now a 2. That is, this new reverse-coded item that I've made has the opposite coding of what the original variable said. After doing this, I can go in and update all of my variable characteristics and information and save my data set with the reverse-coded item, which, depending on what I'm told to do in my instrument manual and in the way in which the survey has been validated, I may or may not use in something like a sum score or a mean score, or when calculating psychometrics such as reliability and validity. This has been a video discussing how to code data in SPSS, talking about, among other things, dummy coding, performing effects coding, collapsing continuous data into categories, collapsing categorical data into fewer categories, and reverse scoring items such as Likert items.